My sister-in-law gave my son a DNA test kit for Christmas to prove he wasn't my husband's child. But when her own son took one too, we found out her kids weren't her husband's. Family can be complicated. No one teaches you how to navigate the unspoken tensions, the rivalries, or the pettiness that sometimes comes with being tied to people by blood or marriage. For years, I thought I had it figured out. I had built a happy, peaceful life with my husband, Caleb, and our son, Mason. I had learned to brush off the constant passive-aggressive comments from my sister-in-law, Laura, and keep my distance when needed. But last Christmas, a single gift changed everything, not for me, but for Laura. She had spent years making snide remarks, stirring up drama, and making me feel like an outsider. And with one calculated move, she tried to destroy my marriage. Instead, she destroyed her own. Laura and I were never close. From the moment Caleb introduced me to his family, I could tell she wasn't a fan. It wasn't obvious at first, there were no outright insults, no fights, but her fake politeness always had a sharp edge to it. At first, I thought she just had a strong personality. Maybe she was protective of Caleb, or maybe she didn't trust outsiders. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. But the longer I was around her, the more I realized that she enjoyed making me feel small. Every family gathering came with her subtle digs. If I wore a new dress? Oh, I almost bought that, but it looked too tight on me. If Mason hit a milestone? That's cute. Dylan was already doing that at his age. If Caleb did something sweet for me? Wow, he never did things like that before you. What did you do to him? I tried to let it slide, for Caleb's sake. He loved his sister, and I didn't want to be the reason they drifted apart. But deep down, I knew, Laura wanted me gone. It happened during Christmas at Caleb's parents' house. We had just finished opening presents when Laura handed Mason a small box, wrapped in shiny gold paper. She had a smug look on her face, but I ignored it. Mason unwrapped it excitedly and held up the gift. It was a DNA test kit. I frowned. It was an odd present for a 5-year-old. Mason had no idea what it was, but Laura leaned in and said, "It's a fun way to learn about where you really come from." She looked right at me when she said it. I felt a chill run down my spine. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a harmless gift. Maybe I was imagining the glee in her expression. But then, later that night, Caleb pulled me aside. "She said some weird things to me earlier," he murmured. His face was tense. Like, how the truth always finds its way out. It clicked. Laura wanted Caleb to think Mason wasn't his son. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. She had spent years planting seeds of doubt, making snide remarks about Mason's lighter features, subtly implying things without ever saying them outright. And now, she was pushing it further. She wanted Caleb to take that test and find out I had cheated. The problem? I hadn't. Mason was Caleb's son. There was never any doubt. Laura just wanted there to be. I was furious. I wanted to confront Laura right then and there, but Caleb stopped me. "No," he said. "We don't give her that satisfaction." Instead, we decided to call her bluff. We told Mason that if he wanted to take the test, we would help him. He was excited, he loved science and had no idea that his aunt had an ulterior motive. We sent the sample off, knowing full well the results would prove Caleb was his father. Laura thought she was so clever. She thought she had just planted the seed that would tear our family apart. She had no idea what was coming. A week later, something unexpected happened. Laura's teenage son, Dylan, had been watching all of this unfold with interest. He thought Mason's DNA test was cool, and he asked his father, Jack, if he could take one too. Jack agreed. Why wouldn't he? There were no secrets in their family. Or so he thought. Laura didn't object. I wonder now if she even considered the possibility that something could go wrong. But as I would soon find out, the truth she had been so desperate to expose wasn't mine, it was hers. 2 weeks later, Mason's results arrived. As expected, the test confirmed what I already knew, Caleb was 100% his father. There was never a doubt in my mind. I could have thrown the results in Laura's face, but I didn't need to. Her silence when Caleb showed her the test said it all. She had lost. But then, something unexpected happened. A few days later, Dylan's results came in. And they changed everything. Jack wasn't Dylan's biological father. Jack stared at the report in shock. His voice was barely above a whisper when he read the results out loud. There was a 0% probability that he was Dylan's father. For a moment, everyone was silent. Then, slowly, Jack turned to Laura. His hands were shaking. "Is this a mistake?" he asked. Laura's face had gone pale. I saw it in her eyes. She already knew. Jack stood up so fast that his chair tipped over. His voice, shaky at first, turned into a roar. "What the hell is this, Laura?" The room erupted into chaos. Laura tried to deny it. She said it must have been a lab error. That DNA tests weren't always accurate. But Jack wasn't buying it. He demanded another test, not just for Dylan, but for their younger daughter, Olivia, too. Laura's face drained of color. She knew what was coming. I sat back, watching the woman who had tried to destroy my marriage, completely unravel. And the best part? I didn't have to do a thing. She had done it to herself. Jack stood in the middle of the living room, the crumpled DNA results clenched in his shaking hand. The Christmas decorations still hung around us, twinkling in the dim light, but the warmth of the holiday had been completely shattered. His voice, thick with disbelief and anger, cut through the stunned silence. "This has to be a mistake." Laura sat frozen on the couch. She opened her mouth, then shut it. The confidence, the smugness she had always carried, the same smugness she had worn when she handed Mason that DNA test, was gone. Jack's fingers curled around the edge of the paper like he wanted to rip it to shreds. He wanted to believe it wasn't true. But I saw the truth in Laura's face before she even said a word. She knew. She had always known. "I don't know what this is," Laura finally whispered. "Maybe it's a lab mistake." "Jack, you know science isn't always." Jack slammed the test results down on the coffee table. "No," he cut her off. "We're doing this again. A real test. A medical paternity test. Right now." His voice was sharp and final. There was no arguing with him. Laura hesitated, then nodded. She was stalling, trying to buy time. But there was no way out of this. Jack wasn't going to let this go. And I had a sinking feeling that Laura's nightmare was only beginning. 2 days later, Jack took Dylan and their younger daughter, Olivia, to a lab for a formal paternity test. The results would take a few more days to come back. But Jack wasn't waiting. That same night, he moved out of the house. The days leading up to the new test results were pure chaos. Laura was desperate to do damage control. She called Jack over and over, but he wasn't answering. She sent long, rambling texts, swinging wildly between begging him to come home and accusing him of being irrational. At one point, she even called Caleb. "She wants me to talk to Jack," he told me, shaking his head in disbelief. "She thinks I can convince him to let this go." I almost laughed. Laura had spent years trying to ruin my marriage. She had spent years trying to plant doubt in Caleb's mind, hoping he would question Mason's paternity. And now, she wanted me to help fix the disaster she had created? No. She could sit in the mess she made. But as much as I wanted to enjoy her downfall, there was one thing I couldn't ignore. The real victims in this weren't Jack or Laura. It was Dylan and Olivia. Dylan had been quiet since the first test results came back. He wasn't asking questions, but he wasn't acting like himself either. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't joking around with Mason. One afternoon, Mason came up to me after trying to play with Dylan. His little face was scrunched up in confusion. "Mom," he whispered, "why is Dylan mad at me?" I kneeled down to his level. "He's not mad at you, buddy. He's just sad." Mason frowned. "But why?" "It's Christmas." I forced a smile, ruffling his hair. How could I explain to a 5-year-old that Dylan had just lost the person he thought was his father? That his whole identity had just been shattered? Later that evening, I found Dylan sitting outside on the porch, arms crossed, staring at nothing. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside him. He didn't look at me. "Is it true?" he muttered. I didn't have to ask what he meant. "I don't know," I admitted. "But your dad loves you, Dylan. No test can change that." His jaw tightened. "I don't even know who my dad is." I didn't have an answer for him. Because Laura wasn't telling him. 3 days later, the new test results came in. I wasn't there when Jack opened the envelope, but I heard about it later. It was worse than anyone expected. Neither Dylan nor Olivia were his. Jack had raised 2 children that weren't biologically his. He had spent years loving them, protecting them, providing for them, and the woman he trusted most had let him. The betrayal cut deep. Jack didn't speak to Laura. He didn't scream at her. He didn't ask her who the real father was. He just walked out the door. And this time, he wasn't coming back. Once the truth was undeniable, Laura completely lost control. She had spent so many years crafting the perfect image of her life. The perfect house. The perfect family. The perfect marriage. And now, everyone knew it was a lie. Jack filed for divorce the very next morning. He also filed for full custody of Dylan and Olivia, using Laura's infidelity and manipulation as evidence that she wasn't a fit mother. That's when the real breakdown started. Laura spiraled. She went from being the woman who always had something to say to the woman who barely spoke at all. At family gatherings, she looked like a ghost of herself, her hair unkempt, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. And yet, she still refused to take responsibility. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't trying to fix things. Instead, she was blaming everyone else. She blamed Jack for overreacting. She blamed me for turning Caleb against her. She even blamed the DNA tests, calling them unreliable and destructive. But no one was listening anymore. She had spent so long trying to dig up dirt on me. And in the end, she was the one with her entire life exposed. The worst part in all of this? Dylan and Olivia were caught in the crossfire. Jack had always been a loving, devoted father, but now he was struggling. He didn't know how to parent them anymore. Dylan, once full of life, had turned into a shell of himself. Olivia, too young to fully understand, kept asking when Daddy was coming home. It was heartbreaking to watch. And as much as I wanted to stay out of it, I couldn't help but wonder, should I step in for the kid's sake? Caleb told me to let it go. To let Laura deal with the mess she made. But every time I looked at Dylan's face, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could do something to help. I just didn't know what. Laura's life was falling apart, and for the first time ever, she had nothing to say. She wasn't making snide remarks. She wasn't stirring up drama. She wasn't whispering her little passive-aggressive jabs at family gatherings. Instead, she was begging. Begging Jack to come home. Begging Caleb to defend her. Begging me, the woman she had spent years tearing down, to convince everyone that this was just a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. The DNA test had confirmed it, Jack wasn't the father of either of her kids. And now, her carefully crafted illusion of the perfect life had shattered. And the worst part? She had done this to herself. The days after the test results came back were nothing short of chaos. Laura was spiraling. Her house, once pristine and carefully decorated to showcase her perfect life, was now a disaster. Dishes piled up in the sink, unopened mail scattered across the counter, and empty wine bottles lined the trash can. She looked exhausted, pale, her eyes red from crying, her once perfectly done hair now unkempt and tangled. But what struck me the most? The anger in her voice. Because even after everything, she still refused to take responsibility. She still believed she was the victim. "This isn't fair," she sobbed on the phone one night, after calling me for the 3rd time that day. "Jack is turning everyone against me. He's making it seem like I'm a monster." I didn't respond. I had nothing to say. I mean, what did she expect? She had lied to her husband for years. She had let him raise 2 children who weren't biologically his. She had spent over a decade building a life on deception. And she wanted sympathy? "I just need your help," she sniffled. "Talk to Jack. Tell him not to take the kids away from me. Please." That's when I snapped. "Are you serious, Laura?" I hissed. "You tried to ruin my marriage. You wanted Caleb to think Mason wasn't his. And now you're asking for my help?" Silence. For the first time ever, Laura was speechless. I took a deep breath, my grip tightening around my phone. "This is your mess, Laura. You don't get to play the victim now." Then I hung up. And for the first time in years, I felt free. While Laura was busy playing the victim, Jack was preparing for war. He had filed for divorce immediately after the second DNA test came back, and now he was going after full custody of Dylan and Olivia. His argument? Laura had spent years lying. She had manipulated him, cheated, and built their entire marriage on deception. She was not a fit mother. And the truth? The court agreed. Jack was stable. He had a good job, a clean record, and a genuine desire to provide the best life for the kids. Laura, on the other hand, was falling apart. Her once polished, put-together image was crumbling. She showed up to the first custody hearing looking disheveled, her voice shaky as she pleaded with the judge to let her keep her children. But the judge wasn't buying it. And that's when things took an even uglier turn. When Laura realized that Jack had the upper hand, she snapped. At first, she begged him to drop the case, swearing that she would be a better person, a better mother. When that didn't work, she got nasty. She started accusing Jack of being unstable. She dug up every little argument they had ever had, twisting them into stories of emotional abuse. She claimed Jack had anger issues and wasn't fit to raise the kids. But there was a problem. No one believed her. Jack was one of the kindest, most patient people I knew. He had never been anything but a devoted husband and father. And the court saw right through her lies. Still, Laura wasn't giving up. She started showing up at Jack's work, causing scenes. She bombarded him with texts, swinging between apologies and insults. One day, she left a screaming voicemail, accusing him of destroying her life. Jack didn't respond. He just saved everything. And when the next custody hearing came, he showed the judge every single text, voicemail, and email. Laura had just destroyed her own case. As much as I wanted Laura to get what she deserved, I couldn't ignore the real victims in all of this. Dylan and Olivia were completely shattered. Dylan, once full of life, had turned into someone I barely recognized. He barely spoke, spending most of his time locked in his room. Olivia, too young to fully understand, kept asking when Daddy was coming home. It was heartbreaking. I hated Laura for what she had done, but I also hated that her choices were hurting the kids the most. Mason, who still adored Dylan, kept asking why his cousin didn't want to play anymore. I didn't know how to explain it to him. How do you tell a child that the family they love is falling apart? Despite everything, I couldn't stop thinking about Dylan. I wanted to stay out of it, I really did. Laura had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. But this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Dylan and Olivia. And part of me wondered, should I try to help? Jack was overwhelmed, juggling the divorce, work, and now a custody battle. Dylan needed someone to talk to. Someone who understood. Someone who wasn't his parents. Caleb, of course, told me to let it go. Laura's toxic, he said. She'll drag you down with her if you get involved. But how could I just sit by and do nothing? If I reached out to Dylan, would I just be making things worse? Or could I actually help? I didn't know. But I knew I had to decide soon. Because the longer this went on, the more Dylan disappeared. And I wasn't sure how much more he could take. Dylan didn't show up to the next family gathering. Neither did Olivia. Jack had been granted temporary full custody while the case played out in court, and Laura had lost it. For weeks, she had been fighting tooth and nail to keep some control over her life, but everything was slipping through her fingers. She wasn't just losing her marriage, she was losing everything. Her reputation. Her family. And now, even her children. But the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. After Jack was awarded temporary custody, Laura became desperate. She started making wild accusations about Jack being a danger to the kids. She claimed he was emotionally abusive and that he was brainwashing Dylan and Olivia against her. The court ordered psychological evaluations and home visits. Jack passed everything. Laura? Not so much. Her erratic behavior, emotional outbursts, and unwillingness to take responsibility for her actions worked against her. Her desperation made her reckless, and the more she tried to fight, the more she proved Jack's case for him. She was unstable. She was manipulative. And worst of all, she refused to put the kids' well-being before her own pride. The judge saw right through her. 3 months later, the final custody ruling came in. Jack was officially granted primary custody of Dylan and Olivia. Laura would have limited visitation, under strict conditions. The judge's final statement was clear. She had prioritized herself over her children. She had created this mess, and she was now living with the consequences. It was over. Jack had won. And Laura? She had lost everything. After the court ruling, Laura disappeared for a while. She stopped coming to family gatherings. Stopped posting her perfect little social media updates. Stopped trying to control the narrative. From what I heard, she moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. The house she had once bragged about, the perfect suburban dream? Gone. Her friends? Gone. Even the people who had once admired her confidence now wanted nothing to do with her. Because when the truth came out, no one wanted to be associated with her lies. She had spent so many years building her life around a carefully crafted illusion. And now, that illusion was gone. With Jack having full custody, Dylan and Olivia's lives slowly started to stabilize. But things weren't the same. Dylan, once a bright, outgoing kid, had changed. He was quieter now. More withdrawn. More guarded. Jack tried his best to support him, but how do you help a child who just found out his entire family history was a lie? It would take years for him to fully heal. As for Olivia, she was young enough that she would probably forget most of this, but I had a feeling that one day, she would have questions. And I wasn't sure Laura would ever give her the real answers. I never reached out to Laura. I had no sympathy left to give. But Dylan? That was different. A few weeks after the ruling, I invited him over for dinner. Mason had been missing his cousin, and I thought maybe, just maybe, it would help. At first, Dylan was hesitant. But when he walked through our front door and saw Mason waiting for him, something changed. For the first time in months, I saw a genuine smile on his face. Mason pulled him into a game, and for a little while, Dylan was just a kid again. I didn't bring up his mom. I didn't bring up Jack. I just let him be. Because that's what he needed. Not more drama. Not more family chaos. Just normalcy. And that night, when Dylan finally laughed for the first time in a long time, I knew I had made the right choice. Months passed before I heard from Laura again. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from her. "Laura, can we talk? I need your help." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. I thought about everything she had done. How she had tried to ruin my marriage. How she had humiliated Jack. How she had destroyed her own children's sense of security. And now, she wanted help? I locked my phone. And I never answered. Because some things aren't forgivable. Final thoughts. Looking back, I realize that Laura's story isn't uncommon. Some people will do anything to maintain control, even if it means hurting everyone around them. She had tried to tear my family apart. She had tried to ruin my life. But in the end, she was the one left standing in the ruins. And I was finally free. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.